Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to play around with these new dies from Sizzix. So I've got the Reindeer Sleigh as well as the Forest Shadow. Before I use those dies, I'm going to create a background, and I thought it would be fun to create a moonlight with stars background using the glow grit paste. I'm working on some distress watercolor paper, and I'm going to ink blend my background first. I'm using a bunch of different distress ink colors. I'll have them all listed and linked down in the description box below. If I remember correctly, I've got Saltwater Taffy, Weathered Wood, Faded Jeans, and Ship Sapphire. I'm using some ink blending brushes to blend the ink onto the watercolor cardstock. I've got a half a sheet of watercolor cardstock here, so it's 5.5 by 8.5, but I'm going to be cutting it down. I'm going to create a 5 by 7 card. I need to create a 5 by 7 card to accommodate the size of the Reindeer Sleigh die. That image is fairly large, and for what I have envisioned in my head, it won't work if I use just a regular A2 card. So I'm making a little bit larger card here. So when I'm doing some ink blending for the background, I like to do all my colors going from lightest to darkest basically, and then I go back and work from darkest to lightest. That way I get a lot of ink on the background and I can really work on blending between those colors. I did find, I don't usually do ink blending on watercolor paper, and I did find it stayed on the surface a lot longer than regular cardstock. Something that was kind of interesting. I wasn't expecting it to do that, but it did kind of stay on the surface. I found that if I was a little bit lighter handed, it worked a bit better for doing some of the ink blending. Whereas if I was heavy handed, it kind of just pushed that ink around, and you can kind of see that as you're looking at the video, that ink just kind of gets pushed and moved. And when I'm using a lighter hand, it does more of blending. So I want to have a nice dark sky here because I want to use that grit paste glow for those stars, and I want to also create a moon on here, and I want to make sure that I've got some decent contrast between the stars, the moon, and the sky. But I don't want it so dark that when I do a black silhouette with the sleigh that you're not going to be able to see this. So when I go back through the colors and go up to my Saltwater Taffy here, I'm making sure on my medium mat to work on an area where I don't have blue on that mat because I don't want to be pulling that in from the bottom. Once I'm done all my ink blending, I'm going to clean off my mat, and then I'm going to get out my grit paste glow with some star stencils and create that in the sky. I'm going to use a palette knife to put it down, and because my cardstock is so big, I'm going to be doing it in 2 different sections here. When I put it down the second time, I'm making sure that I don't have my stencil on top of any of the wet grit paste. If you wanted the stars a little bit closer, you could do that, but you would have to make sure that that first area had completely dried before putting the second area down. Now I am wanting to leave some open space in that center for the moon anyways, so I was fine with there being a little bit of a gap, and you actually don't notice it. Once I lift the stencil up, you really wouldn't know. I'm going to let that completely dry, and while I'm letting that dry, I'm going to work on the moon. Now I have this moon mask here it's from a Stamptember Stamptember collaboration with Tim Holtz and Stampers Anonymous from last year. There are moon masks from Stampers Anonymous. They come in, I think it's a pack of 3. I don't have those. I only have these. Moons are not something that I do an awful lot, so I decided to just use this and not to get the moon masks, but you could easily do this project with the package of moon masks. They come in different sizes from this set, so there is one that's at least smaller, and then there's a couple, I believe, that are bigger than this size. But it's nice to have the variety of sizes to choose from. I just took some light yellow cardstock and then cut a circle with it, just with a circle die that was the same size as my moon here. And then I'm going to take some Pumice Stone Distress ink and just use the overlay to create that detail. Once that's done, I'm going to cover that as well in the grit paste glow, and then set those both to dry, both the moon as well as the stars. I want to make sure it has plenty of time to dry, and while those are drying, I can cut out my different die cuts for my background here. So I'm trying to get an even layer over this back here. Of course, it's a little bit harder to do because I can't actually hold on to the edges while I'm doing it. So I have it on my hand, trying to hold it this way. And I'm just trying to make sure that any of the texture looks a little bit natural. You're going to get texture in it anyways, so you might as well not fight with it. And in the end, I was happy with how it looked. It looked a little bit more natural. So I've got some black watercolor paper here, and I'm die cutting my reindeer sleigh dies out. I'm not going to do the rooftops that are included with this die set. I'm only doing the sleigh silhouette as well as the reindeers. And then there's also some individual reindeers that get glued onto the front of those, and it gives them some extra dimension. So it makes it look like it's really layered, whereas it's actually not. It only has that one layer on top of it, but I really like the look of it. So I do want to take that reindeer, that single one, and I want to die cut it twice to do that overlaying. I also have a bunch of green cardstocks here that I'm going to do the forest shadow trees die and cut those out. I did all that cutting off screen. There's really not much different than when I die cut the reindeer here. So I'm going to glue the reins to the sleigh, and I like the fact that they don't come together, so you can really customize how you want it to look and what angle you want those reindeer in the sleigh to be at. When gluing these reindeer onto the top of the set of 4 reindeer there, I like to use a pair of tweezers to hold it in place. That way I don't get glue on my fingers, as well as the fact that I can shimmy it in place because I'm using some liquid glue. It's really easy to see exactly where everything goes by using the liquid glue. I'm going to set that aside to completely dry. And because I'm doing a background that has stars as well as a moon, once this is dry, I'm going to enhance it with some Perfect Pearls. So I let that dry for a few minutes, and then I took my Versamark pad and I'm just rubbing it along the bottom of the sleigh as well as the bottom of the reindeer. And I'm going to dust on some Perfect Pearls. It's just going to give it like a bit of a gold glow and look like it's a bit of a reflection of light from the moon. I'm also going to take a water brush and I'm going to make a little bit of a paint out of that Perfect Pearls to paint onto the bottom of the sleigh runners. I don't know what those are called, as well as the reindeer horns. Before painting on there, I did take a distress sprayer and I misted that Perfect Pearls that was already on there. Perfect Pearls have a binding agent that is activated by water, and by misting that, once it's completely dry, they're not going to rub off. That's another reason why I like using them for watercolor, is because I'm already mixing water with it. I can make a metallic paint and it's not going to rub off when it completely dries. Now, painting these details on here are really quick and easy. You could also take some gel pens and add those features to it that way as well. I just decided, since I had the Perfect Pearls out, that I might as well paint it on there. I'm also taking some red stickles and giving the front reindeer a little red nose, as well as giving Santa a red glittery hat. I didn't want to attempt to do the suit because I kind of like the silhouette, as well as the fact that I didn't want to mess it up. I took my background here, it's completely dry, and I cut it down to 5 by 7. Later off screen, I actually cut it down to 4 3/4 by 6 3/4 because I wanted there to be a bit of a mat around it while putting it on my card, as well as the fact that at this point I thought I was going to layer everything up here and just have a flat card. In between this stage and what I do after this, I decided I really thought it would be cool if that Santa and sleigh moved. So I created a wiper mechanism to do that, but we'll get to that in a minute. I'm just trying to figure out exactly how many of these die cuts I'm actually going to need for the card. I always like die cutting extras because it's better to have too many than to have to stop in the middle of a project and redo a step or die cut something. I always enjoy having extras. I can always use those extras for other things later. I'm taking some grit paste snowfall and just putting a little bit on the trees just so that they have a bit of a frosty look to them. Now, all of these details with the grit paste glow as well as the grit paste snowfall are adding a lot of texture and dimension, as well as the fact that we have die cuts, which is cardstock laying on top of it. So there's going to be a lot of depth and dimension to it. Had I known ahead of time that I was going to want to make that sleigh and reindeer move, I likely wouldn't have put this much texture and dimension. It still works, but it's not necessary if you've got an interactive element. There are stamps that look very similar from Stampers Anonymous and Tim Holtz that you could stamp and layer these trees. And those stars, you could also either use that stencil with the Perfect Pearls and then mist it, or you could use that stencil with Versamark and then emboss those stars. And there is glow-in-the-dark embossing powder that you could use with that as well. So if you wanted to create this card but not have it as dimensional and as textured, you could easily create layers without actually creating the bulk. So at this point, I had decided I wanted to create this mechanism. I wanted to add a little bit more stability to that sleigh and reindeer, but I didn't want to necessarily have a chunk of cardstock behind it. So I took a piece of acetate. This way it's clear, it's not as noticeable, it is shiny. And if you wanted it to be less noticeable, if you had a piece of acetate that was matte, or if you sanded it to be a little bit matte, might not be quite as noticeable, but I don't really mind the shine behind it. I'm taking some strong double-sided tape. This is Suquang, and I'm gluing that acetate to the back of it. So this is what is going to give that sleigh and reindeer a little bit of structure, and it's not going to have it catch on things nearly as much because it's got that behind it. Once that's glued in place, I'm taking my cutter bee scissors and I'm just snipping off any corners of that acetate piece. There was a little piece underneath the sleigh as well as a little bit under one of the reindeer. Now I'm taking my background, and on the back of it, I'm making a mark in the center about 1/2 inch above the bottom of the cardstock. Once that mark is there, I just used a die pick and pierced a hole through it. I'm going to use a brad as the mechanism for this little wiper element. This is probably not something that I have necessarily come up with. There's probably another name for it, but I just called it a wiper element because it's very similar to the way a windshield wiper works on the back of a car. Then I took a piece of cord with a pen and my die pick and just wrapped it around my pencil so that I could put a bit of an arc. This is going to give me a guideline for where I want to cut my pieces. And then I'm also making a mark in the center of the sleigh where I want that piece to arc. That way I only have to cut just a little area. I don't want this Santa and sleigh to go too far outside my card. It's going to go a little bit because it is fairly large, but I want to have a little bit of control with how far it moves. So by only cutting the slit that far, I can do that. I've got a little piece of cardstock here. This is what I'm going to use for my wiper mechanism, and I'm inking the top of it dark brown or dark blue. This is the chip sapphire that I used in the sky, so at least that's not going to be quite as noticeable, and then I can put it through there. It is a little bit darker than the sky, but it's also a different type of cardstock. This was just a scrap that I had in my bin. I could also have used just a piece of plain blue cardstock, but I always have a lot of white, so I wanted to make sure that to use that way my little piece at the bottom is going to be white, the piece at the top is going to be blue. I did cut my little channel just a little bit bigger to give it a little bit more room. And now I'm taking my die pick and piercing a hole into that little wiper mechanism and putting a brad through it. I'm trying to find the flattest brad that I had to put here. I didn't want a brad that had a lot of dimension because I am going to layer those trees above it, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't have a lot of bulk under there. Now this is where I wouldn't have done the stars with the grit paste had I thought about this ahead of time. Because I have the grit paste and the dimension from that, and I want this little wiper piece to move, I'm taking my die pick and I'm scratching off some of those stars that are in the way. That way this mechanism is not going to get tied up on this when I go to use it on my card. If these images were either embossed, there would be less bulk, or if I had done them with Versamark and Perfect Pearls and then just misted it to set it, there would be no bulk at all. So if you wanted to create a card similar to this, just think about that grit paste and that it does add some dimension, and you may need to remove some of it in order to have this mechanism work smoothly. Once I have all the stars off where I want them to go off, I went and put some of that strong double-sided adhesive on that little tab and then glued my Santa and reindeer on there. Now I can place my moon as well as my trees. I know exactly where they're going to go, and I wanted to make sure to have that Santa and sleigh there ahead of time to make sure that I wasn't going to accidentally put them in the way and have that mechanism get caught on it. Between each step here, I am taking the time to let it completely dry and before adding more layers to it, because I don't want those pieces to shift underneath there while I'm adding more things to it. Now I'm going to start layering and adding the trees. These again have a little bit of bulk to them because of that grit paste snowfall. It doesn't get in the way with the Santa and sleigh because it's high enough. But when I go to layer these all together, it does add some bulk that way because I have bits of grit paste underneath when I'm trying to layer on top. So that's another thing that if I knew I was going to put that mechanism on top of there, this wouldn't necessarily have been as necessary. Or what I could have done was take some of the card, to do the cardstock die cuts, and then just do some stickles. Stickles wouldn't have had nearly as much dimension as this grit paste snowfall. I like to mention these things though, because sometimes when someone wants to recreate another card that someone did, it's nice to know some of the struggles or some of the things that could be changed to avoid different scenarios. It's not that I love this card and how it turned out at the end, so it's not that at all. It's just some things to consider that you may not want to do if you want to do or recreate this kind of look. Once I have all of these trees laid down, I'm going to put my acrylic blocks on them to hold them down and make sure that they have good contact. And I like to put weights on them as well. Again, for the same reason, make sure all that cardstock has some good contact. And I want to make sure that that adhesive is completely dried before I trim off the extras. I am making sure when I put my glue on there to make sure that that glue doesn't go past the outline of the card or the base of the card, because I don't want it to stick, especially to that little wiper mechanism. I don't want any of the trees to be glued down to that, and it's not. But something to keep in mind when you're adding your glue is to make sure not to put too much outside of there. Any glue that's outside and goes and sticks on my mat is fine. It'll just peel right up. But it's especially that wiper mechanism that I didn't want to accidentally have any glue stuck on there. Now that everything is completely dried, I can take my scissors and I can just trim that excess off and make those lines nice and straight. And now I can glue it to the base of my card. Now, the one thing to keep in mind when gluing it to the base of the card is you don't want to put any glue in the way of that wiper mechanism, because you don't want to glue that into place. You want to make sure that it can move freely. So I am making sure to put my glue behind there, keeping it free of that area. I've got a piece of 7-inch by 10-inch cardstock here. I'm scoring it in half to make the card base. And you'll see when I add the glue to it that I'm putting glue on top of that arch, but I'm avoiding right near that wiper mechanism. I got one little tiny bit because I was going too fast, and I can easily wipe that off. And it wasn't in the way of that wiper mechanism. It was right at the edge of the little arc that I had cut, and I didn't want it to glue through there. So once again, I put my acrylic blocks on there, let everything completely dry, and then I decided that that little wiper thing was a little bit too long for my taste. I already know that I need a larger envelope because of the Santa and Sleigh. It goes past the edges of the card, and that's totally fine, but I didn't want that wiper piece to be too big. Here's the finished card. I absolutely love how it turned out, and in a second I'm going to turn the lights off and you can see how cool the glow from the moon and the stars look. I think it turned out really, really cool, and I love the extra wow you get from the glow grit paste on there. It gives so much texture, but then you turn the light off and you see the glow there, and it's really, really cool. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this project as much as I did. Have a fantastic day.